So, what are the most dangerous activities that our children and kids are undertaking? They may surprise you because some of the most dangerous things that our kids are doing are also the most mundane. It's Collegio, and today I'm going to give an ultra realist take on child safety, consumer safety, and adult psychology because the things that we often think are the most dangerous for our kids are actually not that prevalent at all when there are some really dangerous things out there that we may not be focused on enough. So let's get started. The good news is that there's been a ton of progress over the last 100 years with regard to child safety. I did some research, and if you go back to 1930, 184 out of 1,000 children did not even make it to age 5. That was just stunning data, all right? The idea that 18 out of 100 kids in the United States did not make it to age 5, and that was mostly because of infectious diseases, birth complications, and birth defects. Thankfully, there's been a ton of progress in those areas, and those numbers have absolutely plummeted to 17 out of 1,000 in 1980 and only 7 out of 1,000 by 2020. But in order to get a sense for what's going on with the larger age population, 0 to 18, what you realize is that the number one cause of death is actually accidental injuries. So there's some data from 2016, and it shows that among kids 0 to 18, 26 out of 1,000, or 0.026, perish because of accidental injuries. And the biggest culprit is motor vehicles. So if you look at motor vehicles, deaths by motor vehicles have actually dramatically decreased over the last 50 years, although there has been an increase over the last 10 years that I'm going to get into. But for kids, roughly 25% of those are not inside of the vehicle, but outside of the vehicle. Pedestrians and riding your bikes, the other 75% are inside of the vehicle. Very, very serious. Make sure that you're wearing your seatbelts. The second biggest cause of injuries is actually firearms. And this is also a tricky one because if you look at the data, only 5% are accidental, 95% are intentional, either homicides, which is hard to think of even with kids, and suicides. So the lesson there is that if you have firearms, you have guns in the house, make sure to keep them under lock and key because you don't want any accidents, but you also don't want kids doing something that they will regret forever. Third, and the third biggest cause today is suffocation and drowning. Suffocation usually with little babies under the age of 1, and drowning usually with kids under the age of 5. The fourth biggest is poisoning. Again, that one's also tricky because a lot of that is also suicide, intentionally taking too many pills. That accounts for about 8 to 10% of all accidental injury-related deaths. And then the rest is kind of this broad hodgepodge of, heat and cold exposure, ATV accidents, falling, a whole variety of different issues. Now, for the good news is that accidental deaths in the United States among kids has about halved in the last 50 years. And most of that progress has come from automobiles. Just the safety features in automobiles, seatbelt laws have had a major impact on lowering the number of accidental deaths. But as I mentioned, there have been a little bit of an increase. Since 2013, the number has been inching up, and that is mostly because of distracted driving or texting when driving. This is a huge issue. My son recently took a driver's ed course, and one of the things they required him to do was to watch a documentary by the famous filmmaker Werner Herzog about deaths caused by texting and driving. It's a huge issue. Make sure that your kids don't do it. There are apps out there that can control that as well. The other area that is increasing that is really depressing actually has to do with fentanyl and synthetic opioids. I mentioned poisoning, and the numbers have been increasing in a very alarming way over the last 10 years. In 2018, the number of accidental deaths by fentanyl was about 4,600 in the United States. By 2024, it was 6,700, more than a 50% increase in just 6 years. Now, this is a very mundane thing. I don't know that many parents are thinking about the risk to their kids if they attend a party and there happens to be a white powdery drug that kids are passing around. This is a very, very mundane thing, but it is extremely serious, and there needs to be education about the dangers of fentanyl and synthetic opioids in any kind of drug. All right. The third area that's also increasing is firearm deaths. Again, if you go back to the data, all of these things are a little bit intertwined, by the way. Fentanyl, especially with suicides, texting and driving having to do with phones. The third one is firearms. There has been an increase in suicide since 2013. And if you read Jonathan Haidt's book, you realize that social media and handheld devices, smartphones, have really caused an epidemic of loneliness, anxiety, and depression among Gen Z. And unfortunately, and very, very tragically, often these kids turn to suicide. And if there's a gun in the house and it's not locked up, that's a way for them to do that. So please lock up your guns. It's critically important. But there's one other area that is incredibly mundane that I think a lot of people may not realize that is extremely dangerous for kids, and that is the rise of e-bikes and e-scooters. This really, really surprised me. If you look at a report by E-Ride Hero Institute, which is a consumer group, the number of injuries from e-bikes and e-scooters increased by 80% between 2023 and 2024. 80% in 1 year. Now that is, of course, because of the growth of e-scooters, but e-scooters today make up 1/4 of all bicycle-related injuries, and it's hard to imagine that they make up more than 1/4 of all bike-related traffic. They're not as proportionate as bicycles, but they're very, very disproportionate when it comes to injuries. And what's really terrible is that something like 20% of all 131,000 injuries are among kids under the age of 15. And tragically, 31,000 of those injuries are traumatic head injuries. Okay, so again, talk about the tyranny of the mundane. I don't know that parents are realizing that they may be signing up their children for traumatic head injuries when they're buying them an e-bike. These bikes, these little things can be dangerous. I was literally on the road today and there was a guy on a scooter in traffic with no helmet on a 4-lane road. I mean, this is like a type of Russian roulette, but we're giving these to our kids, I think, without properly realizing that you almost need to take a motorcycle safety class in order to ride one of these things. They can get up to 30, 40 miles an hour. If you're not wearing a helmet with one of those things, it is extraordinarily dangerous. So here's the issue, is that some of these things are things that we don't even think about. Riding a bike with an electric motor, fentanyl, okay? But then there are things that we're terrified about. Kidnappings, okay? So just for some stats, the number of kidnappings of children by strangers in the United States was 100 in 2024. All right, so in the whole country of 300 million people, there were 100 kidnappings, okay? 6,700 fentanyl deaths, 31,000 traumatic head injuries. What should we be more worried about, and what should we be training our kids in more? All right. You know, when I was a kid, there was this terrible case of a kidnapping, Jacob Wetterling in Minnesota in the late 1980s. And it had a lot of families, you know, to this day, I think, terrified of letting their kids, you know, walk to the store alone. But it's really, really not a prevalent thing. One of the things that Jonathan Haidt, who is a professor of sociology at New York University, he's an amazing social scientist. He wrote a book called The Anxious Generation. And he talks about how parents often want to shield their kids from the dangers of the outside world. But then they go and they give their kids handheld devices and social media accounts, which they safely use inside of their bedrooms, but it's leading them to a life of anxiety and depression and potential suicide, which is far more dangerous than going out and getting dirty in the backyard, right? Similarly, I think that as human beings, we are apt to be scared of things that are spectacular and novel. The kidnapping case from 1988 still haunts me. This idea that Jacob Wetterling, who was a kid that was my age, could get, you know, kidnapped off of his BMX bike, right? Those things terrify, you know, parents. But at the same time, 31,000 traumatic head injuries from e-bikes. And there are kids all over my neighborhood that are riding e-bikes, and sometimes I see them without helmets. These things go fast and they're very, very dangerous. And fentanyl, oh my gosh, the idea that this was just not even an issue when I was in high school, but the idea that drugs could be passed around at a party and teens could end up dead because of fentanyl is just absolutely staggering and tragic. So I think that it's just important to realize what is truly important, what is truly dangerous, because the things that are very, very dangerous are things that we may not be focused on, and some of the things that we're terrified of are just not all that prevalent. So that's my ultra realist take. Let me know what you think. I am going to drop that E-Ride Hero study in the comments. So if you want to look and see all the stats about e-bikes and how dangerous they are, check them out. Thanks. Drop a comment and please subscribe.